They said courage has a price most people are not willing to pay, but I learned that silence costs even more. And that morning in the small town of Brookhaven, I, Emily Carter, understood it for the first time when I saw Lucas Bennett standing alone near the edge of the schoolyard, clutching his backpack like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The air was crisp, around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of early fall morning where everything looks peaceful until you notice what people are trying to hide beneath it. I was just a second-grade teacher, used to scraped knees, forgotten lunchboxes, and the quiet storms children carry inside them. But what I saw across the playground made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. 3 older boys circled Lucas, not touching him, but close enough to make their presence feel heavier than words, their voices sharp enough to slice through the morning noise of laughing kids and bouncing balls. I started walking before I even thought about it. "Stop," I said, my voice steady even though my heartbeat wasn't. The boys turned, surprised, not expecting anyone to interrupt them, especially not me. Lucas looked up at me like I had just stepped out of somewhere safer than the world he was standing in. That was when I noticed it, a black SUV parked across the street, engine running quietly, tinted windows reflecting the school like a mirror that refused to reveal what was behind it. I didn't know who was inside, but I felt it, that strange pressure of being observed without being seen, like the air itself had shifted direction. Inside that vehicle, Vincent Moretti watched without expression, his gaze fixed on the small moment unfolding at the school gate, cataloging it the way a man might study something he did not yet understand. Emily Carter, 30 seconds into a decision that would change the rhythm of her entire life, didn't know she had become interesting to someone who never noticed ordinary people unless they mattered in ways they did not yet realize. I told the boys to step back, not raising my voice, not showing fear, just choosing to stand where they expected someone to move aside. One of them muttered something under his breath and walked off, the others following like a tide, losing interest once the moment of power was gone. Lucas didn't move until I gently asked him if he was okay, and he nodded even though his eyes said he wasn't used to being asked that question. I walked him toward the building, feeling the weight of unseen attention still lingering behind me like a shadow that refused to break. In the black SUV, Vincent leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but something subtle had shifted in the way he observed the world, like a door inside him had quietly clicked open. He had seen power before, fear before, control before, but what he had just witnessed wasn't any of those. It was something uncalculated, something unowned. And for the first time in a long time, Vincent Moretti wasn't thinking about what he could control, but what he might need to protect. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that my hand was still faintly trembling as I guided Lucas into the safety of the classroom, and outside, the engine of that black SUV continued to run, as if waiting for the world to decide what it was about to become. The moment I closed the classroom door behind Lucas, I could still feel the weight of being watched, like an invisible thread stretching from the schoolyard to somewhere beyond the chain-link fence, and I told myself it was just stress, just another long morning in a job that never really ended when the bell rang. But even as I guided the children through spelling exercises and math problems, my attention kept drifting back to that black SUV parked across the street, still there when I glanced. Out the window between lessons, still unmoving as if time itself had paused around it. Lucas sat quietly at his desk, unusually still for a child his age, drawing in the margins of his notebook instead of talking, and when I knelt beside him to check on his work, he hesitated before whispering that he was fine, a response too practiced for someone so young. By lunchtime, I was called into the principal's office, where I was told in careful, polite language that my intervention earlier that morning had been noted, not as praise, but as concern, because in places like Brookhaven, maintaining order mattered more than understanding why a child stood alone in a playground. I nodded, listening without interrupting, the way I had learned to when silence was safer than argument, and when I stepped back into the hallway, I felt the familiar heaviness of being observed by a system that preferred quiet compliance over uncomfortable truth. Inside that vehicle, Vincent Moretti reviewed the day in silence, not with urgency, but with patience, the kind of patience that came from a life built on observing patterns others missed, and what he had seen was not simply a teacher stepping in, but a decision made without hesitation, a line crossed without calculation, and it lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Emily Carter had not looked around for approval, had not weighed consequences in that moment. She had simply acted, and that was something he had not encountered often in a world where most people negotiated their conscience before they moved. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone buzzed with an email from the school district requesting a formal meeting, and I sat on the edge of my couch for a long time, shoes still on, wondering how a single morning could shift everything so quietly. I did not know that decisions made in daylight can echo far beyond what the eye can see, or that somewhere nearby, a man who had built his life on control was beginning to reconsider what it meant to protect something rather than own it. The email requesting a formal meeting from the school district stayed open on my laptop longer than I intended, the cursor blinking like a reminder that I had stepped into something I did not fully understand. And yet I could not stop thinking about Lucas Bennett sitting quietly in my classroom earlier that day, drawing in silence as if silence was the only language that felt safe to him. The following morning arrived with a sky the color of soft gray paper, and I arrived at Brookhaven Elementary 15 minutes early, expecting routine paperwork and polite concern, but instead I found the principal already waiting for me in the hallway with an expression that tried too hard to remain neutral. He asked me to come into his office, and the door closed with a soft click that somehow felt heavier than it should have. He spoke carefully, explaining that while my intentions were appreciated, there were concerns about disrupting established procedures, about involving myself too directly in situations involving student behavior. And I listened the way people listen when they already know the conclusion but need to hear the language anyway. I nodded, answering only when necessary, my hands resting still on my lap, because movement seemed unnecessary in a conversation where the outcome was already written in the tone of his voice. Outside the window behind him, the street looked ordinary, school buses passing, parents dropping off children, the world continuing without hesitation, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the intensity of the previous day. But when I left the building after the meeting, I saw it again, the same black sport utility vehicle parked half a block down, engine off, windows dark enough that the reflection of the school dissolved into nothing when I tried to look inside. I did not approach it, I did not acknowledge it, but I felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Inside that vehicle, Vincent Moretti had not moved for several minutes, watching the flow of the school morning with a stillness that belonged to someone who measured everything without needing to speak. And what held his attention was not the school itself, but the pattern of one person moving through it, consistent even under pressure, unchanged by authority or expectation. Emily Carter had returned to her classroom that morning as if nothing had shifted, and that in itself was what made him remain longer than planned. By midday, Lucas was absent, pulled out early by a social worker according to the brief note left on my desk, and I found myself staring at the empty chair longer than I should have, noticing how quickly presence becomes memory in a place where children constantly come and go. When I stepped outside that afternoon, the air had warmed slightly, around 60 degrees, and I told myself I would walk home directly, but I found my attention drifting again to the street where the black vehicle had been parked, and this time it was gone. Still, the absence did not bring relief, only uncertainty. That evening, as I reviewed lesson plans at my kitchen table, my phone lit up once more, not with school administration this time, but with an unknown number, no message attached, only a call attempt that ended before I could decide whether to answer. Somewhere across the city, Vincent Moretti set the phone down without speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time in a long time, he was not yet certain what words were appropriate for what he was beginning to consider. The phone screen dimmed after the unknown call ended, leaving my apartment in a silence that felt heavier than usual, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel amplified, like the refrigerator hum or the faint creak of the building settling into the night. And I remember sitting there for a long time with my hands resting on the table, wondering why a single missed call could feel like it carried weight I could not explain. The next morning at Brookhaven Elementary began like any other Tuesday. Children arriving with backpacks too large for their shoulders, teachers exchanging quiet greetings in the hallway, the smell of pencil shavings and cafeteria breakfast drifting through the air, but I noticed something different as soon as I stepped inside my classroom. There was a small envelope placed neatly on my desk, no logo, no return address, just my name written in clean handwriting that felt unfamiliar yet deliberate. I hesitated before opening it, feeling an instinct I could not justify, and inside was a simple note that read only a location and a time for later that afternoon, nothing more. I did not show it to anyone. I did not report it. I simply folded it back and placed it in my drawer, telling myself it was likely a mistake, even though I knew it was not. By noon, I noticed the black sport utility vehicle again, parked farther down the street than before, partially hidden behind a row of trees near the corner where parents usually picked up their children, and this time I did not need to wonder who was inside. Vincent Moretti had arrived earlier than usual, not because he expected anything specific, but because patterns he did not yet understand had begun to form in his mind, and patterns were something he rarely ignored. He watched Emily Carter through the school windows, observing the way she interacted with her students, not with performance, but with consistency, and that consistency mattered more to him than anything else he had seen in a long time. There was no hesitation in her actions, no calculation for reward, only an instinct to step forward when something felt wrong, and that instinct was something he recognized, but did not often see in the environments he controlled. Later that afternoon, when I left the school building, I found myself standing still for a moment on the steps, the air around me around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to be comfortable, but not enough to settle the unease building inside me. And when I finally started walking, I noticed a car pulling slowly alongside the curb ahead of me. The window lowered just enough for me to see him clearly for the first time without distance between us, and I realized the man from the SUV was not just watching from afar anymore. Vincent Moretti did not speak immediately, and neither did I, because there are moments where silence feels like the only stable thing in the space between two people who do not yet understand what connects them, and in that silence, I felt something shift, not fear, not certainty, but recognition of change approaching slowly and deliberately, like a tide that had not yet decided where it would stop. The moment the car came to a stop beside the curb, everything around me seemed to slow in a way that made the usual sounds of the street feel distant, like the world had taken a step back to give space for something I did not yet understand. And I remember standing there with my hands lightly clenched at my sides, unsure whether to continue walking or remain still, because the presence of the man behind the tinted glass did not feel random anymore. The window lowered just enough for me to see him clearly, and for the first time, distance no longer protected me from the intensity of his attention. Vincent Moretti looked at me not as a stranger passing by, but as someone he had already been observing for longer than I could measure, and his voice when he finally spoke was calm, controlled, and unexpectedly direct, asking if my name was Emily Carter. I answered cautiously, my voice steady but careful, and he nodded once as if confirming information he already possessed, not surprised by it, only aligning it with what he had seen. There was no urgency in his expression, no visible threat, only an unsettling stillness that made every word feel deliberate. And when he asked if I had a few minutes to talk, I hesitated because every instinct I had told me that conversations like this did not happen by chance. I glanced briefly down the street, noticing a few parents walking with children, the normal rhythm of an afternoon school pickup continuing just a few feet away, and that contrast made the situation feel even more unreal, as if I had stepped slightly outside of where I was supposed to be. Vincent did not move to pressure me, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to close the distance between us. He simply waited, and that waiting felt more intentional than any demand could have been. Eventually, I agreed to listen, not because I trusted him, but because I needed to understand why someone like him had appeared twice in my life without explanation. He asked me about Lucas Bennett without naming him directly at first, describing a child who had been isolated, and when I confirmed I knew who he meant, his gaze shifted slightly, as if aligning another piece of a larger picture only he could see. He did not ask unnecessary questions, only ones that mattered, and when I explained what I had seen in the schoolyard that morning, his expression did not change, but something in his silence deepened, as if he was weighing not my words, but my consistency in saying them. I noticed then that his attention never drifted, never scattered. It stayed fixed on the meaning behind what I said rather than the surface, and that kind of focus felt unfamiliar in a world where most people listen only to respond. After a moment, He told me that people like Lucas often went unnoticed in systems that were supposed to protect them, and I could not tell if that was a statement or a reflection, but it stayed with me longer than it should have. When I asked why he was there, his answer was simple, almost understated, that he had seen something worth paying attention to, and for the first time, I realized he was not referring only to the child. The air between us felt unchanged yet undeniably different, like a line had been drawn that neither of us had acknowledged out loud. And when I finally stepped back from the car, I carried with me the strange awareness that nothing about my routine would feel entirely ordinary again, because somewhere in the space between observation and intention, Vincent Moretti had begun to treat my presence as something that required a decision. After I stepped away from the car, I walked back toward my apartment with a slow, uncertain rhythm, not because I was calm, but because I was trying to convince myself that what had just happened was still within the boundaries of normal life. Yet every few steps I took felt slightly disconnected from the routine I had always trusted. The air around me had dropped to nearly 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and the early evening lights stretched across the sidewalks in long, quiet lines, but I barely noticed any of it because my mind kept replaying the conversation in fragments I could not fully organize. He had not demanded anything, had not threatened anything, had only asked questions that felt too precise to be random, and that precision was what unsettled me more than anything else. When I reached my apartment building, I paused for a moment outside the entrance, noticing how ordinary everything still looked, the same chipped paint on the doorframe, the same faint hum of traffic in the distance, the same flickering hallway light that always took a few seconds too long to fully turn on, and yet I felt as if something had quietly shifted beneath all of it. Inside my apartment, I placed my keys on the counter and stood there for a moment without moving, listening to the silence as if it might explain something I was missing, but there was nothing except the steady sound of my own breathing. I told myself I was overthinking, that meeting someone like Vincent Moretti twice in a short period of time did not automatically mean anything, but even as I tried to rationalize it, I remembered the way he had looked at me without distraction, as if noticing details other people would normally ignore. Later that night, while reviewing lesson plans again more out of habit than necessity, my phone lit up with a message that contained only a single sentence asking if I was safe. No name attached, no explanation, and for a moment I simply stared at it without responding. Somewhere across the city, Vincent Moretti sat in a quiet room that was too large for how little he used it, reading a brief report that contained no emotion, only observations, yet even in its simplicity, it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. Emily Carter did not behave like someone who calculated risk for recognition or reward. She acted first and reflected later, and that made her predictable in one way and completely unpredictable in another. He set the report down and looked out toward the city lights, not with distraction, but with focus that had no urgency attached to it, only direction slowly forming over time. I eventually set my phone face down, choosing not to reply, not out of fear, but because I did not yet understand what I would be agreeing to by responding, and I lay awake longer than I intended, thinking about a child in a classroom, a black vehicle at the edge of sight, and a man whose presence felt less like an interruption and more like the beginning of something I had not yet named. The next morning arrived with a quiet heaviness that felt different from the days before it, not because anything visible had changed, but because I could no longer ignore the feeling that my life had started to move along an invisible edge I did not fully understand. I arrived at Brookhaven Elementary earlier than usual, around 7:40 in the morning, when the parking lot was still mostly empty and the sound of distant traffic felt softer, almost hesitant, as if the day itself had not yet decided how loudly it wanted to begin. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed a black sport utility vehicle parked farther away than before, positioned near the far end of the street where the trees cast longer shadows across the pavement, and I did not need confirmation to know who was inside. I kept walking, not faster, not slower, simply continuing as if I had not seen it, but my awareness never left it completely. Inside that vehicle, Vincent Moretti observed the same school entrance he had seen before, but this time his attention was not divided between patterns or background movement. It stayed fixed on one thing: consistency. Emily Carter arrived at the same time every morning, entered through the same door, interacted with the same steady patience. And yet each day she did so, without performing safety or hesitation for anyone watching. He had seen many forms of discipline in his life, but this was not discipline in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, something that did not change under observation. By mid-morning, I was in my classroom again, guiding students through reading exercises, but Lucas Bennett's desk remained empty, and the absence of it carried more weight than I expected. When I asked the office, I was told he had been transferred temporarily to another program, a statement delivered without detail, and I understood enough to know not to push further in that moment. During lunch break, I stepped outside briefly, needing air more than silence, and that was when I saw him again, not in the vehicle this time, but standing across the street, dressed simply, blending in more than before, yet still unmistakable in the way he carried attention without asking for it. Vincent did not approach immediately. He only waited until I noticed him, and when I did, I found myself slowing without realizing it, stopping at a distance that felt neither close nor far enough to feel safe or distant. He spoke first, asking if the child was still at school, and when I confirmed he was not, his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly, like a calculation completing itself. I asked him why he was still here, and he answered without hesitation that he was trying to understand something that did not fit easily into the patterns he was used to. The way he said it did not feel like a threat or an explanation, but rather an acknowledgement that something outside his control had already begun to matter. I did not know what to say to that, so I simply stood there for a moment, aware that people passed us on the sidewalk without noticing the tension in the space between us. When I finally stepped back toward the school, he did not stop me, did not follow, but I could feel his attention remain where I had been standing, as if distance itself had not yet reduced what he was trying to understand. That afternoon, I returned to my classroom with a quiet uncertainty I could not name, and for the first time since everything began, I realized that whatever connection had started forming between my ordinary life and his was no longer something I could pretend was accidental. The afternoon light had begun to soften when I finally finished my last class of the day, and the usual sounds of Brookhaven Elementary, footsteps in hallways, chairs scraping, distant voices of children being picked up, felt strangely distant, as if I were hearing them through water. I gathered my things slowly, not because I had extra time, but because I could not shake the feeling that something important was waiting just beyond the exit doors. When I stepped outside, the air was around 62 degrees Fahrenheit, calm and still, but the moment I looked up, I knew I had been right. The black sport utility vehicle was no longer parked far away or hidden along the street. It was directly in front of the school now, stationary, quiet, and unmistakably present. I stopped walking without meaning to, my fingers tightening slightly around the strap of my bag, as I tried to understand why seeing it there felt different from before. The door of the vehicle opened before I could decide whether to continue forward or turn back, and Vincent Moretti stepped out with the same controlled calm I had seen every time before. But now there was something different in the way he moved, less distance between intention and action, as if a decision that had been forming quietly had finally reached its conclusion. He did not approach quickly. He did not attempt to close the space between us in a way that felt intrusive. Instead, he simply walked until there was a natural stopping point between us, close enough for conversation, far enough to allow choice. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I realized that the silence this time was not uncertainty, but resolution waiting for acknowledgement. He said my name first, not as a question, but as confirmation that what he had been observing had led him here deliberately. Then he told me that Lucas Bennett was safe, that the situation I had witnessed days earlier had been addressed in a way that ensured he would no longer be placed in that environment again. And although he did not give details, I understood that whatever system had failed the child had been redirected by forces far outside the school itself. I asked him why he was telling me this, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering that he had been trying to understand why someone with no obligation to intervene had chosen to stand between harm and a child without hesitation. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that felt quieter than before, less observational and more certain. He said that most people calculate risk before they act, but I had not, and that difference had made me impossible to ignore. I did not know how to respond to that, because I had never thought of my actions that morning as anything other than instinct, something that simply had to be done. Around us, the school continued to empty, parents arriving, children leaving, The ordinary rhythm of an afternoon continuing as if nothing unusual was happening, and yet the space between Vincent and me felt like it existed slightly outside of that rhythm. He finally said that he did not expect anything from me, not gratitude, not agreement. Only acknowledgement that what had begun to form between observation and action was real, even if it was still undefined. I asked him what that meant, and for the first time his expression softened in a way that did not remove intensity, but redirected it. He said it meant that some people pass through life unnoticed, and some people change the way they are seen, and that I had done the latter without realizing it. When I finally looked away, it was not because I was afraid, but because I understood that nothing about this moment was accidental anymore. And as I walked back toward my car, I could feel his presence remain behind me not as pressure, but as awareness, as if the space I had just left would not return to being ordinary again, because something irreversible had already been recognized without needing to be spoken aloud. The days that followed did not return to normal. Even though on the surface everything at Brookhaven Elementary continued in its usual rhythm, morning bells, lesson plans, lunch supervision, and the quiet exhaustion of teachers moving through structured hours, but something beneath that routine had shifted in a way I could not ignore. I began noticing patterns I had previously overlooked, the same black sport utility vehicle appearing not at the same time, but at the same distance from me, always present at the edges of my movement through the day, never obstructing, never intruding, only observing. At first I told myself it was coincidence, a trick of attention caused by stress and lack of rest, but the consistency of it made that explanation harder to accept with each passing day. Inside that vehicle, Vincent Moretti remained mostly still, his presence defined less by movement and more by intention, and what had started as observation had slowly evolved into something more deliberate, though not yet defined by words. He did not approach me again immediately, and that absence of direct contact was itself its own form of communication, as if he was allowing space for something to reveal itself without pressure. Meanwhile, my life continued in its expected structure, teaching children, grading assignments, attending meetings that blurred together in polite language. Yet I found myself increasingly aware of how often I checked reflections in windows or slowed slightly when passing parked vehicles that matched a certain shape or darkness. Lucas Bennett had returned to school part-time, quieter than before but present, and I noticed that he no longer looked toward the playground with the same hesitation I had seen earlier, as if something about his environment had been quietly corrected without explanation. I did not ask questions, because the absence of answers felt intentional, and I was beginning to understand that some changes were not meant to be discussed openly. One afternoon, after classes had ended and most of the school had emptied, I remained in my classroom longer than usual, organizing materials I did not need to organize, simply because I was delaying the moment I had to step outside again. When I finally did, the sky was already shifting toward late evening tones, soft orange fading into cooler gray, and the parking lot felt unusually still. The vehicle was there again, positioned farther away this time, but unmistakable in its stillness. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk without moving forward, and after a few seconds, the door opened. Vincent stepped out without urgency, and I noticed something different in his posture, not change in confidence, but change in decision, as if what had previously been open had now reached a point of definition. He did not begin with questions this time, nor did he repeat anything from before. Instead, he told me that what he had observed over the past several days had confirmed something he rarely allowed himself to accept. That intent without expectation was not as uncommon as he had believed, but it was rare enough to matter when it appeared consistently. I listened without interrupting, aware that his words were not meant to persuade, but to acknowledge a conclusion already reached internally. He said that most systems rely on predictable behavior, but people do not always behave predictably when they are acting on principle rather than advantage, and that distinction was what had made him return more than once. I asked him quietly what he intended to do now, and he paused long enough for the silence to feel intentional before answering that he was not there to interfere, but to ensure that what he had seen did not go unnoticed or unsupported. There was no demand in his tone, no pressure behind the statement, only clarity. For the first time, I understood that his presence was not about control or intrusion, but about alignment with something he had not expected to take interest in. When I finally turned away, It was not because the conversation had ended, but because I realized it had already changed direction long before either of us spoke it aloud. And as I walked back toward my car, I felt the strange awareness that the space between my life and his was no longer defined by distance, but by recognition that could not be undone. The following morning arrived with a strange sense of stillness that felt different from everything that had come before it, as if the routine of Brookhaven Elementary was continuing on the surface while something deeper had already begun to shift beneath it. I arrived at school at the usual time, around 7:45 in the morning, when the parking lot was still half empty and the air carried a cool temperature close to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. But I noticed immediately that the black sport utility vehicle was not in its usual position. For the first time in several days, there was no visible sign of it anywhere near the school grounds, and that absence created a feeling that was unexpectedly more noticeable than its presence had ever been. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was simply a change in routine, but I found myself slowing slightly as I walked toward the entrance, listening to the quiet of the morning more carefully than I usually did. Inside the building, everything appeared normal: children laughing softly in hallways, teachers preparing their classrooms, announcements echoing through the intercom. Yet I could not fully disconnect from the awareness that something had shifted beyond what I could see. Lucas Bennett was in class that day, seated at his desk, no longer isolated, but still quieter than the other students, and I noticed that he looked up when I entered the room, not with hesitation this time, but with a brief moment of recognition that felt more stable than before. I did not speak to him about anything beyond schoolwork, because something about the situation made it feel as though questions were not necessary in the way they normally would be. By midday, I stepped outside during my break, more out of habit than intention, and for the first time in several days, there was no vehicle waiting at a distance, no presence watching from across the street, only the ordinary movement of traffic and people going about their day without interruption. Yet, even in that absence, I could not fully relax, because silence that arrives after consistency often carries its own kind of meaning. Later that afternoon, when classes had ended and I was preparing to leave, I noticed a small envelope placed inside my mailbox at school, identical in appearance to the one I had received before, again without any return address or indication of origin. Inside was a short message, not a request, not an instruction, but a location and time for the following evening, written with the same calm precision I was beginning to associate with a single person. I did not show it to anyone, and I did not report it, not because I felt comfortable with it, but because I was beginning to understand that whatever was unfolding did not operate within the usual systems of explanation. That night, I sat at my kitchen table longer than usual, the note placed in front of me, untouched, while I tried to make sense of why my life had become something that seemed to move parallel to another life I had not agreed to enter. I thought about Lucas, about the empty parking spot, about the absence that felt heavier than presence, and I realized that Vincent Moretti had not disappeared. He had simply stopped needing to be visible in order to remain relevant. Somewhere across the city, decisions were still being made without my participation, and for the first time, I understood that what had begun as observation had evolved into something that no longer required constant proximity to continue. The note had been sitting on my kitchen table for hours, untouched, yet impossible to ignore, as if its silence carried more weight than words ever could, and I found myself moving around my apartment in small, aimless patterns, checking the time more often than necessary, listening to the faint sounds of the building settling into night. It was around 6:45 in the evening when I finally decided to leave, not because I understood what I was walking into, but because ignoring it no longer felt like an option I could justify to myself. The air outside was cooler than expected, close to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and the streets of Brookhaven felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes every distant sound feel closer than it should. I drove without music, without distraction, my attention fixed on the directions written on the note, which led me toward the edge of town where the streets became less familiar and the buildings more spaced apart. When I arrived, I found myself in front of a small, neutral-looking structure that did not reveal anything about its purpose from the outside, and for a moment I simply sat in my car, engine idling, wondering why someone like Vincent Moretti would choose a place like this. I did not see him immediately, and that absence of presence made the moment feel uncertain, But when I finally stepped out of the car, I noticed him standing near the entrance, not moving toward me, not calling out, only waiting as if time itself had already accounted for my arrival. There was no tension in his posture, no urgency in his expression, only the same controlled stillness I had begun to associate with him. But this time it felt less like observation and more like conclusion. When I approached, he acknowledged me with a simple nod, and for a brief moment neither of us spoke, allowing the distance between intention and understanding to exist without interruption. He finally told me that what he had been observing was not about interference, but about patterns that repeated when systems failed to notice what mattered most, and that Lucas Bennett was now in a stable environment where his circumstances had been quietly corrected without further disruption. I listened carefully, realizing that he was not asking for approval or agreement, only allowing me to understand that something I had been part of had been resolved beyond my direct involvement. I asked him why I was brought here, and he took a moment before answering, not because he was uncertain, but because the answer required precision rather than simplicity. He said that people often move through systems assuming they are fully seen or fully understood, but that most important moments in life happen when someone is noticed outside of those systems, and that I had become part of that exception without realizing it. The way he said it was not dramatic, it was factual, yet it carried a weight that made the surrounding silence feel more defined. I looked around briefly, noticing how isolated the location felt compared to the rest of the town, and for the first time I understood that this meeting was not accidental, but also not forced in the way I had feared. Before I could ask anything else, he added that he did not intend to disrupt my life, only to ensure that what had already occurred was not lost in silence or dismissed without recognition. There was no expectation attached to his words, no implied direction, only acknowledgement of something that had already been set in motion. When I finally turned to leave, I realized that nothing about the situation had demanded a choice from me, yet everything about it had quietly expanded the space in which choices could now exist, and as I drove away, I understood that the line between my ordinary world and his had not been crossed in a single moment, but had been slowly redrawn without either of us ever stating where it began. The morning after the meeting at the edge of town arrived with a strange sense of equilibrium, as if the world had not changed on the surface, but had quietly accepted that something underneath it no longer belonged to chance. And I woke up earlier than usual, around 6:30 in the morning, unable to return to sleep even though nothing external had disturbed me. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of traffic beginning to build outside my window, and I realized that for the first time in days, I was not expecting to see a black vehicle outside my school, yet the absence of expectation did not remove awareness. At Brookhaven Elementary, everything appeared unchanged when I arrived. Children entering classrooms, teachers preparing lessons, the same predictable rhythm of education continuing without interruption, but I found myself noticing details I would normally overlook, such as the way people move when they believe they are not being observed. Lucas Bennett was present that morning, sitting in his usual seat, and although he still spoke very little, there was a subtle difference in the way he held himself, less guarded than before, as if something external that had once pressed against his environment had been quietly removed. I did not ask him any questions, and he did not offer any explanations, but when our eyes met briefly during class, there was a moment of recognition that felt less uncertain than it had in previous days. During lunch, I stepped outside alone, not because I expected anything, but because I was beginning to understand that expectation itself had become irrelevant to what was unfolding around me. The school parking lot was ordinary, filled with the usual vehicles, no sign of anything unusual, and yet I stood there longer than necessary, observing the space where things had once appeared and disappeared without explanation. Later that afternoon, when classes ended and the building slowly emptied, I remained behind longer than usual, organizing materials that did not require organization, simply delaying the transition back to the outside world where uncertainty felt less contained. When I finally left the building, the sky was beginning to dim, and the temperature had dropped slightly to around 56 degrees Fahrenheit, and I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the sidewalk across the street, not hidden, not distant, simply present. Vincent Moretti did not approach immediately, and neither did I, because at this point distance no longer felt like avoidance, but like a space that allowed understanding to form without interruption. When I finally crossed toward him, there was no repetition of earlier explanations, no continuation of previous conversations, only a shared awareness that the pattern between us had reached a point where further observation alone was no longer sufficient. He told me that he would not continue to appear in ways that disrupted routine, that his presence had already served its purpose in identifying what needed to be understood, and that what followed would no longer require his direct visibility. I asked him what that meant for Lucas, and he responded that the child's environment would remain stable, not through intervention that demanded attention, but through adjustments that ensured stability without drawing focus to their origin. His tone was calm, not final, but resolved, as if the structure of events had already been set into motion beyond the need for further input. I realized then that everything I had experienced was not leading toward a single dramatic moment, but toward a gradual separation between what I could see and what was being managed outside of it. When I finally stood there in silence, I understood that nothing about my life had been forcibly altered, yet nothing about it could be considered unchanged either, because the boundaries of what I had assumed to be ordinary had expanded without permission or resistance. And as I walked away that evening, I no longer wondered whether I was part of something larger, only how long it had already been in motion before I ever noticed it. The days that followed did not return to what I once considered normal, but they settled into something quieter, something that no longer demanded constant interpretation of every shadow or every passing vehicle, and I began to understand that absence can also be a form of resolution. At Brookhaven Elementary, the routines remained unchanged: morning attendance, lesson plans, hallway announcements, the steady rhythm of education continuing as if nothing had ever shifted beneath it. Yet I noticed that I was no longer searching the edges of the parking lot when I arrived or left. The black sport utility vehicle did not return, not in visible form, not in distance, not even in the subtle patterns I had once begun to recognize, and over time that absence stopped feeling like uncertainty and started feeling like closure. Lucas Bennett continued attending school regularly, and although he remained quiet in the way some children are quiet after learning more about the world than they should have, there was a lightness in his presence that had not been there before. He smiled occasionally during group activities, participated without hesitation when called upon, and returned to drawing not as an escape, but as something closer to expression. I never asked him what had changed, and he never offered explanations. But sometimes understanding does not require language when the outcome is visible in behavior. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the last time I had seen Vincent Moretti, I received a sealed envelope placed discreetly in my school mailbox, identical in appearance to the previous ones, but containing nothing more than a single line written in careful, deliberate handwriting. It did not request a meeting. It did not provide instructions. It only stated that what needed to be stabilized had been stabilized, and that further contact was no longer necessary. There was no signature, but there did not need to be one. I stood in the empty classroom holding the note for a long time, not because I was uncertain of its meaning, but because I was finally certain of what it represented. That evening, I walked home without looking for anything beyond what was in front of me, and for the first time in weeks, I noticed the ordinary details of the world again: the sound of distant conversations, the steady movement of traffic, the fading light of a late afternoon that did not feel charged with expectation. A few days later, I saw Lucas leave school holding his mother's hand, speaking softly about something trivial and unimportant in a way that suggested he no longer carried the weight he once had, and I realized that whatever invisible structure had been placed around his life had done what it was meant to do without leaving visible evidence behind. As for Vincent Moretti, there were no more appearances, no more vehicles, no more messages, and yet his absence did not feel like disappearance. It felt like completion. I never learned the full scope of what had been arranged beyond my awareness, and I no longer felt the need to, because I understood that not every force in life is meant to be seen in order to be real. Some influence exists only long enough to correct what was unstable, then steps away without acknowledgement, leaving behind only the outcome. And in that outcome, I found something unexpected: not fear, not gratitude in its loudest form, but a quiet understanding that my life had intersected with something larger for a brief period of time, and then been returned to itself intact. Brookhaven Elementary continued its days without interruption. Lucas continued growing without fear, and I continued teaching without looking over my shoulder, because somewhere in the space between visibility and silence, everything that needed to be protected had already been secured, and nothing remained unfinished.